My hope is we can get SB 1130 done this year on an expedited basis, free up the agency to really remedy these harms, and as well as free up the capacity of local governments that are kind of in a war room footing right now to explore their options to build out their own networks.
Welcome to episode 409 of the Community Broadband Bits podcast. This is Jess Delfiaco, Communications Manager here at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. In today's episode, Christopher talks with Ernesto Falcone, Senior Legislative Counsel at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Ernesto gives Christopher a brief history of the organization, and the two discuss the Electronic Frontier Foundation's involvement in repealing California's municipal broadband preemption. Ernesto also talks about the California Advanced Services Fund program, why so many people have been left without internet access during the pandemic, and what the future of connectivity looks like. Here's Christopher talking with Ernesto Falcone of the Electronic Frontier Foundation.
Welcome to another episode of the Community Broadband Bits podcast. This is Christopher Mitchell from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance in St. Paul, Minnesota, talking with someone who's a bit warmer, a bit sunnier, Ernesto Falcone. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, Ernesto, you're not only in the California area, you just have a very bright disposition, I've noticed over the years. You are the Senior Legislative Counsel for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which most people know as EFF. Just a little bit of background. What's EFF?
Yeah. So the Electronic Frontier Foundation, we're a nonprofit public interest law firm, meaning we do representation for free on issues impacting First Amendment, Fourth Amendment rights, as well as a handful of technology policy issues that impact speech and privacy. We are basically three different teams, lawyers, engineers, and activists, and we've been around for 30 years. We're about to hit our 30th year anniversary, and the origin of EFF when we started was the internet was coming, technology was coming, and how do we protect what we have now in terms of our rights and our ability to communicate and share with one another as it becomes more digital. Yeah, and those fights have kind of spiraled in many different directions. And my special area of focus with EFF is broadband access and kind of what's the future of access to make sure everyone has the same high-speed access that they deserve.
How did you come to that?
So I have always tinkered with technology growing up. So I was born in 1981. So there's a time when, as a kid, you're playing with video games and computers and people or your adults would tell you like that's not a thing you could do for a living. So because it just wasn't
right.
People didn't think that was possible. The internet didn't really exist, and then it became dial up. And I just kept up with the hobbies, and eventually the hobbies turned into a career. I went to the political space right after college, did some campaign work, and realized that's not exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to really focus on the technology policy, which was still kind of in its infancy, and went to Washington, D.C. and worked in Congress. Did that for 6 years, and during that time you had the big fight on net neutrality. That was in 2005, which really convinced me this is the direction I wanted to go. I eventually joined a nonprofit consumer group called Public Knowledge, and made my way to law school out in
Never
California.
heard of them.
Yeah, made my way out to law school after that because I was surrounded by a lot of lawyers that I thought were doing brilliant work, and I wanted to be one too. And and from that point, I met Corinne McSherry, who's the legal director of EFF.
Yeah, she's been on the show maybe 3 years ago or so.
Oh, yeah, excellent. Yeah. And, I worked with her in D.C. and I talked to her, to get advice about what to do. I wanted to stay in the policy work, didn't want to litigate as a lawyer, but I still wanted to stay in California. And it was just fortuitous that EFF was also trying to bulk up its policy and legislative work. Prior to that, it was mostly focused on litigation and kind of making progress on that front. But there are limits to that. And some of these fights have to be fought in the halls of Congress as well as in state legislatures. And so that was my primary reason to be hired at EFF in 2015 now.
And that's where you and I started crossing paths on a more regular basis, was around AB 1999, which is almost 2 years ago now, I guess.
That's right.
When California became one of the few states to repeal preemption. It was a pretty minor issue, but I'm really excited you led the fight to make sure that they got rid of it. You want to just tell us what that was about?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's always been great to work with you and and all the great work your organization does, because I think it is proven what industry has tried to convince lawmakers is not possible, which is we don't have to depend on them; we could just build it ourselves. So for background for folks, so AB 1999 was a law that happened at the exact same time, or I guess shortly after the FCC repealed net neutrality in 2017. So 2017, that happened towards the end of the year, or towards the middle of the year, and the states start responding on what to do about broadband access at home. We had a big fight on California on net neutrality as a law called SB 822. And at the same time, we had this parallel fight on municipalities and them, and local government building its own open networks that were net neutral as well. And that's AB 1999. And the trick that the industry pulled off in California, because it's never a frontal assault on the idea that no one else should build something but us. It's always these kind of silly side arguments. And the argument there was, you should allow private industry to buy public assets if they build a broadband network as a means to ensure that private investment, is robust and not driven out by the public sector. And in effect, what it actually did was made the public sector take the risk of how to provide service in difficult to serve markets. And if they're able to pull it off, which thanks to the work of your organization kind of showing this has happened everywhere, once they've proven it's doable, it's actually financially feasible, and then lo and behold, the private company will buy it out to absorb the profits that would have gone back to the taxpayer.
It's just hard to imagine why anyone would have thought that was a good idea, even at the time. It's just,
yep.
It's pretty nuts to think that you would basically force a community to sell something that they had built. I mean, there's a lot of shenanigans that these companies pull, but a lot of times it's more complicated than just saying, nope, doesn't matter how popular it is. There's no recourse. The public just has to get rid of it.
That's exactly right. And there's just a lack of understanding. And that's starting to disappear little by little. I think more so this year than ever before. But a lack of understanding the role of the public sector in broadband access. You go back 5 years, 6 years ago, and most people thought, you really just had to rely on figuring out how to get the private companies to build everywhere. And it's become obviously a great number of people, but that's not happening. And the number of people who are deniers of that reality are dwindling.
Well, the thing I find really interesting, and I don't know how much of this you saw, but I'm sure you've heard stories even if you didn't see it yourself. It used to be that it seemed like AT&T owned the legislature. People often associate AT&T more with ruling Republican-led legislatures. You think about Marsha Blackburn, who was surgically grafted onto AT&T. But in California for a long time, AT&T was very popular with the Democrats. They basically got what they wanted, and lately it seems like that's changed quite a bit.
It's changing, but it's taking an extraordinary amount of grassroots work to make that happen. I think the industry, really led by AT&T in Sacramento, do get a lot of what they want because the amount of money they give the California Democratic Party is fairly prolific, and the number of relationships that are built from that are pretty pervasive. And quite frankly, the ignorance of a handful of legislators, I would say a great number of them, this industry is not really leading us to the bright future they keep promising. Kind of hand in hand in terms of the legislative favors and regulatory favors is always this promise of, you do this for us and we will deploy in your unserved or underserved market. And, we're at 2020 now. I remember I had a conversation with a staffer just a week ago about this dynamic. And I said, by this point, I think we're Charlie and the football's been pulled enough times, right? And the staffer couldn't help but laugh because it's just undeniable.
So I want to skip over a lot of the really good work you've done on net neutrality and some other tech issues and focus on some recent developments. The California Advanced Services Fund, I think it might help to just start with a little primer on what exactly is CASF?
Certainly. So California is one of few states that directly finances the infrastructure of broadband, or at least high-speed internet access. And I'll explain why I make a distinction there in a sec. But we created this program to kind of work in parallel with federal efforts to build out internet access to difficult-to-serve markets, usually rural, but at times urban and in related markets. But the problem has been the program has set its targets so low that it's kind of hamstrung at the moment. And it's kind of particularly noticeable at a time when a vast number of Californians need high-speed access, in particularly in these rural markets, but we're all ordered to stay at home under COVID-19.
So right now, if I live in rural California and I'm pulling down 8 megabits down and 1 megabit up, or even probably honestly a fraction of that, but it's advertised as being that, then I'm not eligible for the California Advanced Services Fund's subsidies to get better networks, right?
That's right. So the trick is, when they originally created CASF, which is the acronym for California Advanced Services Fund, was meant to look at markets that were 6.5 megabits per second down and I believe 1.5 up. It was actually doing fairly decent work. It was financing fiber in public housing. It was building out middle mile open access fiber networks. It was doing such good work that it was running out of money. And so the legislature, in order to pass a new financing of the program, takes a 2/3 vote. That's how it's structured there. the industry held enough influence to, makes it hard for a 50% plus one vote to get done. And so a lot of bargains and compromises were struck with, particularly with Frontier and AT&T leading the discussions here, on the premise that, okay, if you lower the threshold of what is served to 6 megabits download, 1 megabit upload, and this is 2017.
Right, not ancient history, pretty recent.
This is 3 years ago when the federal government 2 years prior said 25.3 was the definition of broadband. Yet companies telling legislators in Sacramento, 6.1 seems good enough. We shouldn't be subsidizing or putting money into neighborhoods that have DSL, basically. The trick behind that strategy was effectively to make it impossible for the state to build out high-capacity networks. Because lo and behold, when the government did its data analysis about what areas don't have 6.1, it is very difficult to find areas that are complete deserts of 6 megabits down, 1 megabit up. And the trick with KSIF and the way they structured it was, if you had a small handful of households in an area with that connectivity, even like you're an anchor institution like a hospital or a school, then you can't really serve the area because that area has internet access. Therefore, it's not worthy of state funding. And so the end product of that was, in the last bid for that put out $360 million of California money to build broadband, only about $30 million of it was applied for, because there's just not a way to cohesively make a bid under the criteria that the ISPs established.
Right. I think it may help to illustrate if I just make up some numbers, which I think people accuse me of doing too often. But let's just assume for a second, there's 40 million people in California. There might be 1 million people that don't have that connectivity, or 500,000 or whatever it is, but they don't all live next to each other, right? California is also a big place. And so you have like 30 people here, 10 people there, and you can't put a business model together on the basis of that.
That's exactly right, because networks are meant to be, holistic in terms of the deployment. You're casting a net to capture as many of the payers into that net to help finance the construction. But what the data showed, as EFF looked at the maps of what is a 6.1 and non-6.1 area, it's effectively Swiss cheese. It's a whole bunch of tiny little pockets spread throughout the state, and it misses the fact that you probably have areas that have 10.1 that are being excluded, and that's an inferior speed for any of the needs that people have today. And so it's just like a situation where I'm not surprised that despite a bunch of money being available for bid, these are grants, so they're covering 50% of the cost. It's a very attractive offer, but no one could really figure out how to financially put together a cohesive package in a Swiss cheese matter. Networks don't operate that way.
Okay, so that's what has led to KSIF actually having extra money right now, although the legislature could always put more money in there to supplement it. What is happening to improve the program in order to make sure that you're actually financing better networks rather than just watching money accrue a small amount of interest?
Yeah. No. So something that EFF has studied thoroughly in the last handful of years is, what does a 21st century internet look like? What is a universal, affordable, high-speed network that's good for not just now, but the next generation and generations after? And the conclusion is fiber, and fiber to the home in as far as you can go, which quite frankly, we could do a lot if the will and the focus was there. Now, how do you write quote unquote fiber into a broadband finance program? You really look at projects that should be once built, useful for future upgrades on the cheap in order to keep up with the increasing demands of internet access. Often a challenge in policy, both federal and state, has been we try to build out what's good right now in terms of internet access, and without any sort of recognition of the speed limit that comes with that choice. And that often plays into the hands of the old incumbents who, quite frankly, can upgrade their old stuff incrementally on the cheap, and that's attractive, but it's also has a pretty clear dead end.
As long as they're writing the laws. I mean, I was comparing, upgrades of DSL. It doesn't really help us get to a higher quality network because it's a dead end, as you just said. It would be like telling someone, well, just keep upgrading your bike and sooner or later it will turn into a moving van. It doesn't work that way.
Yep. And especially when, someone has already invented the moving van that's cheaper to run, and it's getting better by the day. It's just one of those things where communities that don't have next generation high capacity networks being built are in real danger of joining the unserved communities, in the sense of eventually services and applications that we use. Like, I think COVID-19 story is like Zoom and other video conferencing exploding in usage. you can't do that if you don't have a decent upload, and you can't do that if you don't have a decent download. And so suddenly your formerly known as broadband connection has become the dial-up, and none of us willfully use dial-up as a means to connect to the internet right now. That's the worry EFF has about the lack of access kind of growing as a result of next generation application services that are really beneficial to people to use, being out of reach because, one, you don't have access at, even at a minimum, a cable monopoly. What does that mean to society in terms of democratic participation, education, and all the other very important values that the government should be prioritizing?
So let's talk about a bill that you're kind of shepherding in some ways, a bill that State Senator Gonzalez has put forth, SB 1130. What will that do to try to fix the problem you've just been describing?
Yeah, so Senator Lena Gonzalez and EFF have been working together on the bill that she produced. And the idea behind it is let's set a minimum standard of 25 megabits down, 25 megabits up, so symmetrical uploads and downloads, because people are generating as much content going out now as they are in, with a requirement of low latency, because the capacity to make it near real-time interactivity is really important right now. And set that as a standard of what is served and unserved. And what that should do is markets that have competition between fiber and cable, markets that have fairly upgraded fiber coaxial hybrid cable systems probably would fall above that number on average. And then the markets that are still either with nothing or completely reliant on DSL would be eligible for an upgrade. This would ideally allow a lot of the local governments that have been kind of clamoring at the bit to take a bond out and build out their own infrastructure, as well as a handful of small private companies that are eager to expand, but they just don't have the vast reservoirs of capital themselves to build out on their own, to help solve this problem of not only the digital divide, but also what EFF calls the speed chasm between legacy networks and networks backed with fiber.
You mentioned the issue around symmetry, that people produce so much more than they used to. I think you said they produce as much as they consume. I can imagine that some people, particularly folks who really believe WISPs are the next best step to solve this, which are often can be symmetrical, but in rural areas are more often asymmetrical, it seems, even though they're higher capacity. They may say, no, people still download a whole lot more than they upload. And so why would 25 symmetrical be the standard?
Yeah, the only reason people download more than they upload is because that's what they're being sold. Something I often run into when we talk to policymakers at the federal and state level, when they think about what the future broadband speed should look like, and I see numbers like, what about 100 up, down, and 20 up? And I pause them and I say, you have to understand the asymmetry has absolutely nothing to do with broadband as a technology, and has everything to do with the fact that cable television distribution networks were converted into cable modems and cable networks, cable information networks.
No, Ernesto, I actually prefer to upload to Dropbox using a much slower connection. I could do it at 100 megabits, but I really like to upload to Dropbox at 20 megabits.
That's exactly right. And so, it's just like, it's part of the history of why there's been asymmetry and why the new networks that get built, particularly when they have fiber and plenty of spectrum capacity available, are perfectly able to do symmetrical distribution of information. And that's a preferred route. I mean, at the end, if we want people to be able to start a business at home, for example, you need them to be able to communicate with their customers and their followers, if they're like an artist of sorts, in a way that is robust. And there's no reason why the technology doesn't support that. It does. It's just policy sometimes looks too much at what the current industry is doing without a recognition of what the technology is capable of.
Well, I would add on to that by noting the cable companies increasingly are going to be able to do symmetrical with upgrades. It will cost them money. They'll have to invest in it. But I mean, historically, I think we've had asymmetry in policy just to accommodate DSL and to some extent cable. And I don't know how much longer we want to keep doing that.
Yeah, I mean, if policy is doing the right thing in terms of taking a big step back, the point of federal policy has been from the 90s is universality, competition, affordability. And if those things are happening, which are not in a great many places right now, which means we have to really rethink some of the larger policies here. If they were working, the cable companies would eventually become fiber companies. The WISP would eventually would finance eventually into full-fledged fiber companies as well. Like basically everyone would eventually adopt the same type of high capacity networks and try and figure out how to go further and higher and beyond. But yeah, exactly right. We're tethered to the legacy, to the past. And the real tragedy in that is the European Union is not doing that. The Chinese are not doing that. The South Koreans and Japanese are not doing that. All the other countries that we compete with on a whole host of fronts have long moved past this kind of dynamic. And, they're building universal fiber. I mean, that's their goals.
Well, if there's one thing that I can tell you as I sit here in my home interviewing you in your home during business hours, it's that we have very good information on what the future will be like. And we should assume there will be no shocks in which suddenly having a mere 2 or 3 megabits will be a significant pull on the economy because of people trying to work from home while their children are schooling from home and all kinds of other challenges right now.
Yep, that's exactly right. One thing I think sometimes media might miss is COVID-19 isn't what it's showing us in terms of internet access is what the near future looks like. It's not necessarily this is only the one-time blip and it won't be this bad in the future. No, this is what it was heading towards anyway. As we all started moving to like remote computing and cloud computing and remote education, things like that, and they're going to be a greater number of have and have-nots that have always been there. It's just now it's much more pronounced.
So let me ask you one other question, which is something that opponents of the bill are definitely raising as well. But, we have on the order of hundreds of millions of dollars. If you define the problem in California as being those who don't have 25 symmetrical, that's a multi-billion-dollar problem to solve. What happens when the money runs out?
So I think, it's one, you're absolutely right in terms of the larger scope of the challenge. 2, the investment is worth it because it'll pay itself off because everyone needs the access, and it's going to be good for long past my lifetime. To them, I say, okay, yeah. So you tell me it costs, it's going to be $2 or $3 or $4 billion. I said that's fine. I mean, because at the end of the day, everyone needs this. It's essential to the future. It's essential to this economy, and it'll be valued many times the investment within its usable lifetime. I think if we don't get more of in the initial dollar amount that's there, or as that money starts running out, I suspect what will happen is legislators will see the great benefits that are occurring as a result of the initial investment, and it actually won't run out of money. It will simply be additional funds will be re-added over time to keep it going until the job is done. I think that's just the story of many of these efforts is once you launch an initiative of sorts and the government sees this is really doing a lot of good, it's very difficult politically to then say, well, okay, I guess we're done, or like let's just fold up our chairs now. Everyone sees the value in this.
Well, I think that's also a reminder of the importance of taking seriously how these programs are structured, making sure the rules are right, because sometimes people make assumptions that because something has a really good intent, it will be implemented well. And I think one of the reasons we're having a crisis in government is many of the government programs that have been slandered have been done so unnecessarily. But there have been a number of programs that have been designed not as well, and sometimes because industry specifically gets in there to try to monkey wrench it. We saw this with the stimulus 10 years ago, where the big companies really fought hard to make sure that the money went almost entirely to middle mile. And then years later, they said, look, we hardly connected any homes. This was a wasted program. And you're like, well, you didn't let us connect homes. Of course we didn't connect many homes.
Yep. Now I remember, as a legislative staff, and I remember Verizon's big argument was, we really have to focus on the middle mile. Middle mile is really important, and they're not wrong in that. But it's similar to, so long as you're not building something that disrupts what we want, which is our monopoly markets where we exist as monopoly, or creates what I would say expertise and knowledge from an alternative provider that can be a bigger competitor over time. That's kind of the looming threat that all of these companies fear.
So let's end up with talking about what KSF is doing just to deal with the immediate onslaught right now of trying to make sure people have some sort of connections. What's because I'm on the dockets, I get tons of emails. I haven't had any time to jump in, but what's the argument been about lately?
So Commissioner Guzman at the CPUC, so we have 5 commissioners at the CPUC, and Guzman's really a leader on thinking about kind of future networks and what's a 21st century internet look like. And so she led an effort to inquire what should KSF do in response to COVID-19. Should there be any changes to the program and as a result of the challenges people have? And those challenges really are I think very tethered to remote education. That's probably one of the biggest driving things that are happening here in this state, because our schools have been closed for almost 2 months. There's questions of whether we open in the summer to try and make up the time. There's questions of how do we open at all in the fall if this isn't resolved, and the need to ensure every kid can get access to their homework and to their teachers is a driving force. You have schools trying to give out hotspots as a temporary Band-Aid, which is really frustrating in that the only reason they have to do it is because the infrastructure is not there. You have the school board association, related to all this. They are putting out a potential ballot measure at the November this year for $2 billion in just on connectivity to try and make sure every student can get access to public education. The CPUC is trying to figure out what to do with KSIF as a means to address this. And what's fascinating is, so EFF commented on this proceeding because there's on an emergency expedited basis of, whatever you do, don't finance networks that are not up to the task of remote education and distance work and social distancing in general. There's this New York Times piece that came out, and we're seeing more and more data show this. Those legacy networks, the DSL networks, and even some of the cable networks are degrading from the increased usage, which is insane in the sense of, okay, so everyone is using the internet they're sold, and now the networks can't actually deliver said products that they're advertised at. Whereas on the other end, my understanding is every local government or private company that's doing fiber directly to people has had zero challenge meeting the increased needs. And so, again, part of EFF's effort with the law and the legislation SB 1130 is to focus on high capacity future-proof networks. Is to prevent money to going to slightly upgrading networks that are still not up to the task, even with the state money, because it's a waste. It is a monumental waste to build up something that is not going to be ready, and just because we're going to have to replace it anyway with what we should have done from the start.
And so where is that? Is ready to implement something, or is there still ongoing rulemaking? What exactly is happening next regarding their ability to respond to COVID-19?
Well, yeah, the California Public Utility Commission, which governs and administrates KSIF, they're in a tough spot because they can help on getting devices and access into the equipment in terms of working with industry and working with the schools and trying to form partnerships. But in terms of direct financing of the infrastructure to solve the problem, they have the statutory limits that the 2017 law that AT&T Frontier helped draft have placed on them. And so what's ironic and kind of bitter in this is, you have big companies like Crown Castle, for example. It's a multi-billion-dollar fiber company saying you should be doing a minimum standard of 25-25 for eligible areas, in order to correctly, ascertain which areas are insufficiently served for today's needs. And lo and behold, the cable companies and telephone companies, the big ones, that is, the old ones, who helped write that law, say absolutely not. You're legally not allowed to do that because that's what the law says. And because that's the law we helped write. My hope is we can get SB 1130 done this year on an expedited basis, free up the agency to really remedy these harms, and as well as free up the capacity of local governments that are kind of in a war room footing right now to explore their options to build out their own networks, as well as a lot of, I think, very good intended small private companies that are trying their best to work with their local communities to figure this out too.
Well, I hope we get there. I really appreciate the work you're doing. Thanks for taking time today to fill us in.
Absolutely. Always happy to do it. Always love listening to the program.
That was Christopher talking with Ernesto Falcone of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. We have transcripts for this and other podcasts available at muninetworks.org/broadbandbits. Email us at podcast@muninetworks.org with your ideas for the show. Follow Chris on Twitter. His handle is @CommunityNets. Follow muninetworks.org stories on Twitter. The handle is @muninetworks. Subscribe to this and the other podcasts from ILSR, Building Local Power, Local Energy Rules, and the Composting for Community podcast. You can access them anywhere you get your podcasts. You can catch the latest important research from all of our initiatives if you subscribe to our monthly newsletter at ilsr.org. While you're there, please take a moment to donate. Your support in any amount keeps us going. Thank you to Arna Huseby for the song Warm Duck Shuffle, licensed through Creative Commons. This was episode 409 of the Community Broadband Bits podcast. Thanks for listening.